Hi guys, this is the first of several videos I'm going to put up on my YouTube and Instagram TV channels. And what I'm going to do right at the end on the last video is to set out very clearly the kind of things we need to do in order to set the country on a different and better path. I'm going to talk to who should be part of that effort and why we, the generation that is not so young but not old at the same time, or the professional class, in fact, let me put it like that, we need to step up and start working for the country that we want, the country of our dreams. So I'm going to start in 1994 and just after the election, basically, and talk about the constitutional assembly that we had, because a new constitution had to be framed and agreed upon, and that happened in 1996. The Constitutional Assembly had at its head Rolf Meyer and Cyril Ramaphosa, who is now our president. And that constitution created a set of institutions that would be the pillars of this democracy. And those institutions were Parliament, it was the judiciary, and it was the executive, and that is the government. Each of them have very clear roles. But in our system, Parliament has the ultimate power. How? Because it is the only structure that can amend the constitution by a 2/3 majority. And there have been many amendments between 1996 and now for practical reasons, not just for the sake of expediency. But out of a constitution, you then make laws to give meaning to a constitution, because it's not a big volume. A constitution is supposed to be a small document which sets out the principles upon which laws and institutions are going to be built. So to give you an example, we never used to have the National Treasury as we had. We had several departments. SARS was called the Department of Inland Revenue. You then had the Department of Finance, and you had the Department of State Expenditure, for instance. Then the Constitution changed, and we had the Public Finance Management Act. And the Public Finance Management Act gave birth to the Treasury. And you now had an agency called the SA Revenue Service, and you had the Ministry of Finance, which is quite small within the Treasury, but you know, the whole thing is the national Treasury as we know it. It's got a Director General, but there's still a Minister of Finance and a Deputy Minister of Finance. That's just an example. There was also the Municipal Finance Management Act and so on. The reason you got those laws is because the Constitution set certain rules in terms of how money is to be collected, how money is supposed to be used, and how the government is supposed to account for that money. And so that's how you get from a constitution onto a law, onto regulations, and so on. But further, there was other legislation, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, in order to give workers their rights. For instance, the Labor Relations Act for the resolution of disputes, the CCMA, the Labor Court, the Labor Appeals Court. Some of these institutions were there before, but quite a lot of them were reformulated in order to align with a new way of doing things, which was the Constitution. What I'd like you to note is that the people that were working on reframing the country back then were quite young. The Tito Mbowenis of this world, the Trevor Manuels of this world, the Togo Didizas of this world. I can carry on and on and on. A lot of people who are in their 60s now, 30 years ago almost, were working on reshaping the country. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going. But the central argument I want to make is the following, is that constitutions and institutions are built in such a way that they respond to the conditions under which you are operating at the time, and they also reflect how that society and that political system and the actors in that system see the future. And therefore you say, this is the framework that is going to take us to prosperity in the future. Now, there were certain decisions taken. For instance, we had been a racially polarized country because of apartheid, and one of the major concerns was that we should not have an electoral system where the minorities, but it really meant white people, the minorities are not going to be represented in parliament. So let us have a proportional representation system. But a proportional representation system, as opposed to a constituency system, while it might have worked then, we've learned over time that it gives the power to the political parties. And the political parties are able to choose who can sit in parliament and who can be removed. And therefore, when you have an MP who is Jajarach, that MP is simply removed and replaced by somebody who is going to toe the party line. In the case of a party that is governing the country or is governing a province, that means the people who determine which MPs or MPLs are going to sit and provide oversight, basically supervise the executive, they also depend on the executive for their jobs, because the party leadership, the party president, and the president of the country, or premier in some instances, are one and the same person. So how do you oversee your boss in the party if the system does not protect you against victimization? So those were some of the trade-offs that had to be made at that time. So that's just one example of how institutional arrangements are responding to current conditions as you're dealing with, and you say you're going to use that in the future. Now, this proposition that I'm making is, at some point in the future, you've also got to look at your conditions and determine whether the rules you had set so many years ago are still appropriate and they still work and take you to prosperity or not. Now, what do we know just out of this one choice to have this kind of electoral system that works in this way, that we all know that it works, where the only time that politicians take voters seriously is at election time. Otherwise, you completely get ignored, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So we've got to look at what has subsequently happened as a result of that. Yes, we had many opposition parties because with a proportional representation system, and white people and whoever else felt threatened have been adequately represented in parliament. But we've also learned that over time, parliament has not been effective as a result of the party bosses learning out of the system and saying, we need to teach these people how to shut up. And we are going to do that by bullying them within the context of the party. And so we have had a parliament that has failed to effectively supervise the electorate, the executive, sorry. What has that led to? That has led to the same political parties that are supposed to debate issues in parliament having to resort to the courts in order for the courts to adjudicate over decisions that are taken in bad faith by the governing party, so that the courts may tell them to stop doing it. So the Nkandla issue, for instance, is a case in point where the public protector has said that the South African people are owed money by the former president and he needs to pay it back. And the governing party, which is the ANC, decides that's not going to happen. Now, there is no way of successfully overturning that if you don't have the majority and the MPs in the governing party feel that they have no choice but to protect their boss. So off they headed to court. And you know there have been many of these cases that have ended up in the courts. What has that done? That has had the effect of clogging up the High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, but in particular the Constitutional Court. Really think about many of the cases that have ended up at the Constitutional Court. They've all emanated from politicians acting in bad faith and refusing to do their jobs. Whether it was the appointment of rogue National Director of Public Prosecutions, the disbandment of the Scorpions, the formulation of the Hawks to replace the Scorpions in a way that was never going to fight corruption. And subsequently, we have had a system that has been very, very corrupt to the extent that we now have the State Capture Commission to investigate fraud and corruption. We have had an SIU investigation to investigate PPE fraud and others. So what we know is that out of the 1996 Constitution, we've had very weak accountability, such that if we don't change this system where voters are just mere spectators, we are going to continue having other problems. That's one example. The other example has got to do with the powers that the president and ministers have to apply their discretion. For instance, to appoint a rogue as National Director of Public Prosecutions, to appoint unsuitable people to some or other position without parliamentary oversight. Now, you may have seen, and this is not foolproof by the way, but in the United States, for instance, when the president wants to appoint all the cabinet members, there is something called a confirmation process, which means that person needs to go to Congress, which is their parliament, and testify. That is, they get asked questions by the representatives of the people, and they may vote for them or not. So there are several instances where someone is deemed by the parliament to be unsuitable. That system is not necessarily ideal, and there is lots of bad faith there as well, where the members of the party of the president automatically support the candidate and the opposition automatically opposes. But at least the people of that country get to hear from the person who is about to be a minister. Now, I am not saying that we must replicate that system, but I am saying that system recognizes that ultimately it is parliament that is the ongoing representative of the people. And if somebody is going to be given enormous public power, then they need to account to the representatives of the people, not just when they are appointed, but on an ongoing basis. So for instance, in South Africa, we no longer see ministers accounting to parliament. Now, that's just absurd. They go and they give a speech in the National Assembly and take questions there, but they don't go to committees, for instance. So the Minister of Human Settlements doesn't go as often as they should to the Human Settlements Committee for the same reasons that I've given. So what am I getting at? I'm getting at the fact that we need some very fundamental changes at a political level. But that's just at the level of the state. We also have to think about the social changes that we need. There are cultural issues which are sometimes at odds with the very constitution that we have. For instance, there is still racism, there is still sexism, there is misogyny. Queer people get victimized, bullied, beaten up and killed in South Africa. In a democratic state where supposedly they can get married and enjoy all the rights. So we do need to change the way our society thinks. And there are many other points that I can make. The last example is how we have accepted a state that does not work. And people take pride in sending their children to expensive private schools. But the reality is actually we should not be paying so much money for medical aid. We should not be sending our children to expensive private schools, because being taxpayers, the health system should work, and it should be possible in any community to go to a community health center to get flu medication and so on, without having to pay in addition to your tax to pay for private medical care. It's the same with security. We all have security companies, even though we've got law enforcement agencies that we seem to have accepted that are dysfunctional. No society can function when you've got a parallel state. To the state, you've got the equivalent of the government doing the same thing that the government is supposed to do itself on behalf of taxpayers. So the propositions I'm going to make are around how you drive fundamental change in the country and the social contract we should all ascribe to, and that this is not just about replacing the ANC, it's about a way of thinking. It's about how we understand the framework that is going to take us into a brighter future in a context where the world is modernizing fast, it's evolving fast, and we really cannot fall behind as a country. So in this video, I've just explained what I am going to do in subsequent videos, but join me next week, because I will start then tackling the issues one by one, until in the last video I round everything up and say this is the total proposition about how we move forward. Thank you.